Dave, I think even though it's September, a Happy New Year sort of in order, right?
Happy New Year indeed, Tom, as we say in Hebrew, Shana Tova.
How is it a New Year? Explain. Our non-Jewish friends wonder, what in the world are we talking about right now?
A lot of people hear sort of, it's the Jewish holidays. September, usually it's later in September, but they always kind of vary, early September to early October.
I heard a comedian, when I drive around my car, I have this radio channel it's clips from comedians. I love stand-up live comedy, and it's just funny. And there was a Jewish guy on there this morning, comedian, and he was saying of all the problems that he has with his own religion, one of it is he never knows when the holiday is. He's like, come on, Jews, get your calendar in order. We should at least pick a season when these things happen.
It would be nice. It would be easier that way. The Jewish holidays Jews follow the lunar calendar rather than the sun and how many times we go around the sun.
The Gregorian calendar.
This week is Rosh Hashanah. Next week is Yom Kippur, and that is sort of the week, the New Year's celebration week. It's the year 5782, according to
I did not know that.
According to the Jewish calendar.
Okay.
So it's a lot of years.
Yes, it is.
It just kind of shows how far back this actually goes.
Normally you and I talk about, we kind of preview most of what we're going to discuss. So I'm going to apologize up front because I don't know how well known this is. I want to ask you a question about that dating. Say it again,
5782.
5782. What's the beginning moment? Do you know, according to that dating? What happened at day 0 or 1?
As I understand it, it was the creation. However, we didn't really start keeping a formal calendar. When you go through the story of Rosh Hashanah at synagogue on Rosh Hashanah, on the first day of Rosh Hashanah, it actually talks about really starting to count it following the Exodus from Egypt. But it's like they added years at the beginning.
Okay.
So it's hard to know exactly when, but the Exodus from Egypt is when the records were first sort of began to be written down, right? I mean, obviously the commandments come down during the Exodus.
Yep.
So Genesis, the first book of the Torah, the first book of the Bible of the Old Testament is the beginning.
Right.
Exodus is not the beginning, but they didn't technically start counting years until during Exodus. So they probably just roughly figured out, we're going to add 200 years to the beginning or something like that. And I'm sure there's a rabbi who could give a much better explanation than that.
Right.
This is my once a week Hebrew school classes was a kid.
Yep, I get it. So my understanding of this important Jewish holiday is it's meant to be kind of a time of reflection.
Correct.
Thinking back at the last year, reflecting on that, what does that mean for you personally? What does it mean for family, friends, community, all these sorts of things?
In the grand tradition of Jewish guilt, we don't take the new year and say, here's our New Year's resolutions.
No resolutions.
There's no resolutions. The holiday is intended to reflect on your previous year, the good, the bad, how you can be better, how you can be a better part of the community, how you can be a better person. And then obviously we go 9 days later is Yom Kippur. It's the Day of Atonement. It's the day you recognize all of your and your community's sins from the previous year and ask God to absolve you of those sins.
Or maybe the writers at the 1619 Project, they certainly think that we're guilty of a lot of sins, and maybe we need to ask them for atonement.
I suspect they have no interest in giving atonement to any Jew.
I think that's, or probably any American, really.
Probably not.
So in the spirit of honoring my Jewish friends' holiday, I've been doing a little reflecting.
Okay.
Over the last year. I mean, the last year's been. It's been one hell of a year, man. It's been a really strange year in so many ways. And I came away with, I think, reflecting on the last year reveals 3 wonderful takeaways. I am feeling incredibly optimistic after reflecting on this last year. And I know probably you, Dave, and a lot of our listeners are thinking, is Kranwitter high right now? Why would he be optimistic? Here's why. I think there are 3 huge takeaways from the last year. results matter, truth matters, and life matters. And all of those are really good things. The first, results matter. This has been a theme at the Vino Veritas Society.
Sure.
We did a case study explicitly on this, that when you're looking at government policies and programs, pay attention to the actual observable, measurable results rather than just the intentions of the people who create and support these programs. Well, look at everything that's been going on. The whole debate about COVID and masks and vaccinations, that continues to go on today. We're not out of this. This is still happening. What's the whole emphasis? Even take into account you have progressives who lean one way, you have many conservatives leaning a different way, but they do seem to agree on one thing: results matter. I've heard nobody has said, well, the inventors of these vaccines had good intentions. Their intention is for you to feel better. That's why you should take the vaccine. Nobody says that.
Right.
Progressives don't say that. Conservatives don't say that. They all seem to agree that real results matter. The only disagreement is on what those results are. How are they measured? How are they categorized, right? And that's a fair discussion to have. When you're measuring and compiling statistics, there can be questions about whether, the accuracy in the counting, and are the categories exclusive and exhaustive, and all these kind of things. But there seems to be near unanimous agreement right now in the United States that results, actual results, really matter. I could not be more cheerful than to hear that news, because I want to say to my fellow Americans, well, if results matter, let's not just measure the results of COVID vaccines. Can we start paying attention to the results of the war on poverty and the war on drugs and the United States Department of Education and Obamacare and all these other government programs and policies?
I don't want to quell your optimism, and I don't want to be the naysayer. But I will point out something that is a little bit alarming about this whole new results matter attitude. You and I, again, we didn't talk about this beforehand. So,
so this is a little improvisation here.
The problem with their new results matter approach is now they're trying to blame somebody. And they're saying it's anybody who didn't get the vaccine, anybody who didn't wear a mask, children under 12. All of a sudden, children under 12 are the problem because they can't get vaccinated. So we have to go worry about them, and what are they going to do, and the schools, and they're starting to blame.
There's a really fascinating little part of that blame game that no one's talking about. It turns out when you look at the populations of where you find the most unvaccinated people, you know what the biggest variables are, or I guess the biggest identifying coefficients are? Poverty, and race. It turns out a lot of Americans with darker color skin aren't getting the vaccines. And so if progressives really wanted to point the finger of blame, they'd point at poor black people and say, "Shame on you! Why aren't you getting? But they don't actually want to say that.
That would be like pointing at them and saying, "How dare you not get an ID to go vote?"
Right.
They can't say that either. So somehow it's everybody else's fault that there's not enough clinics or whatever. But this whole blame game is slightly concerning to me, because I am worried. Okay, so the next time when we say, "Well, you've had this war on poverty for 50 or 60 years. How's that working out?" Well, that's the rich people's fault. It hasn't worked because those rich people aren't paying their fair share of taxes. The war on drugs, it's because you're not providing clean needles. And so people, they come up with these things that make no sense.
It would still be a wonderful conversation to have about the actual results. And say, okay, we have done these things. In the case of the war on poverty, we've spent almost $25 trillion that you and I have talked about this before. That number is so staggering. I always remind people that's more money that we spent on all military wars from the American Revolution all the way through to the war on terror, to the war in Afghanistan. All of them combined pales compared to what we've spent on the war on poverty and what are the results. So I just like the fact that we have large agreement right now that results actually matter. And that kind of connects to the second big takeaway. Truth seems to matter right now. This is This is an amazing development in postmodern, post-truth, progressive America, where the argument for 2 decades has been, hey, it's all about your individual feelings, your perspective. Who's to say what's right or wrong? Who's to say what's true or false? Everyone can craft their own narrative, and that's your truth or her truth or his truth, right? And all of a sudden, it seems Americans, including our progressive friends and fellow citizens, they want to know actual, objective, measurable, observable truth that can be discussed and debated. That, too, is an amazing development, that truth has become back in vogue, at least for the moment. And then, over the course of the last year, we saw black and white signs crop up all over in yard signs. Black Lives Matter. And that is, now I'm going to give here some credit to our fellow citizens that I don't know if they deserve it, so I'm just going to be a little generous and a little charitable.
Okay.
That is the conclusion of a classical syllogism.
Okay.
I don't know that they thought the syllogism through, but here's the syllogism. The major premise is the lives of human beings matter. That's the major premise. The minor premise is black people are human beings, therefore the conclusion, Black Lives Matter. That's how you get to that conclusion. So inherent, whenever anyone says Black Lives Matter, inherent in that conclusion is the major premise, life matters, human life matters. And this has been, I mean, one of the massive, ugly sea changes in American culture and policy has really been this movement towards a culture of death, a cult of death in the United States. And it's good to see Americans standing up and saying, life matters. I cheer them on. I agree that life matters and that truth matters and that results matter. I'm feeling really optimistic.
You know what would be a fascinating conversation about what you just said about Black Lives Matter?
Yeah.
Are the incredible parallels between the syllogism you just gave and the Three-Fifths Compromise.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And these people who put Black Lives Matter signs hate the idea of the Three-Fifths Compromise.
Yep.
But it's the same thing.
Absolutely.
And it would be fascinating if you could actually get one of them to listen long enough to understand the Three-Fifths Compromise. And maybe we'll do a future episode on this or something in the future. Might even be a good just side lecture for us to do it at some point.
Yeah.
But
we can't just leave it hanging. We got to throw this out for our listeners. Know this about the Three-Fifths Compromise. The people who most despised slavery wanted to get rid of it. And they did not want to reward slave states for having big slave populations. They said, you don't get to count slaves at all.
Yeah.
You in South Carolina, Alabama, Georgia, where there are large slave populations, the most anti-slavery members of the Constitutional Convention said, you don't get to count your slaves at all. 0. Not because they're not human beings, because we don't want to reward you. Why should you get more representation in Congress? And it was those who had the most interests tied to slavery. Delegates from South Carolina, from Georgia, they stood up and said, we want to count our slaves as full people. They would have been happy to count them as 2 or 3 because it would have meant their population would have been bigger, and therefore they would have gotten more representatives in the United States House of Representatives.
Right.
So the Three-Fifths Compromise had nothing to do with any suggestion that a black human being was a fraction of a human being. It was a fight over, do Southern states get more power for having big slave populations, or are they going to get less power?
And to add on top of that, just to make sure everybody knows what we're talking about, it set the foundation for the future for Lincoln to say, see, you guys all agreed that they're people.
That's right.
Right? They are people. They are human beings. And the whole argument was, if you don't treat them like human beings, they shouldn't count as human beings in your census and shouldn't affect your
because
numbers in the House of Representatives.
No state was counting 3/5 of cows.
Right.
Or 3/5 of horses or donkeys or mules or pigs or dogs or cats or anything else, because there was unanimous agreement these slaves are human beings. The question is, does Georgia get to count them as part of their population, which determines how many representatives they get? It also determines how many electoral college votes they get in the election of a president. Does Georgia get more representation more power because they have imported and purchased large numbers of human beings. That was the fight.
And so to your point of Black Lives Matter means lives matter, it's the nihilistic viewpoint that life doesn't matter, nothing matters.
Right.
So this progressive nihilism that has infiltrated our society over the last 50 to 100 plus years is this idea that life doesn't matter. Nothing really matters other than you finding your happiness or your contentment while you're on Earth.
Yeah.
And that's it. It doesn't matter what part you play in the community or anything else. So I think all good reflections on the last year. It'll be interesting to see if we could convince any of our progressive friends to accept the fact. I mean, you've seen how they've reacted when people say, no, all lives matter. And Black Lives Matter. Black lives definitely matter. And we all agree.
Yeah.
Black lives definitely matter. So do Asian lives, and so do Indian lives, and so do white lives, and so do pink lives, and whatever else you
Human
can think
lives
of.
matter. Lives of babies matter, including black babies and babies of other colors. They matter. Life is, well, here's a great lesson that both Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas agreed upon. Life is good. Life is good. And they didn't mean that just as a feeling or an emotive statement. There was a long argument behind why life, in fact, is good. And it's a precious thing that should be cherished and protected.
Sure. In that sense, we look back on the last year. We look at our communities. We look at our role in our communities. And there are things that we can all do better as well. And I think it's important to bring that up because it's really a foundational idea of what we're doing here at the Vino Veritas Society. And what I hope all of our members take away, whether you're in a chapter, whether you're a digital subscriber, we can always do better. We can always be better citizens, better friends, better family. We can always do better. And that takes work. It takes education. It takes learning. It takes knowledge. I think for me, as I've gone back, I've really looked at how can I be a better citizen? How can I be a more virtuous citizen, right? There's a reason we've talked about the virtues. And it's interesting, this year more than any else, I mean, we're now over a year into this podcast. We have, for more than a year, we have been here every week in the studio except for 1 week. We have been here talking about what it is to be a better, more virtuous citizen, how to think more like the founders. And I actually, interestingly, Monday night after services, I sat up at 1 o'clock in the morning writing a letter to my rabbi, telling him that very thing. I said, my takeaway from the year is I'm going to be a better, more virtuous citizen. I'm going to continue to work towards being a better, more virtuous citizen. I'm going to try to encourage others to do the same.
I want to point out something that's kind of inherent in what you're saying. It's intrinsic to what you're saying, and yet it's so subtle, a listener might easily miss it. When we talk about being better or improving ourselves in various ways, it's a wonderful concept. It's a wonderful way to think, and it's very contrary to the postmodern, post-truth, progressive way of thinking. In this regard, to say I'm going to be better means I am somehow measuring. I'm comparing myself to some standard outside myself.
Sure.
And here I'm going to sound a little Platonic, right? There's some idea or ideal of what it means to be a good person or what it means to be a good citizen. There's that ideal. And so I compare myself to the ideal. I see that I fall short. I can improve by getting closer, more closely approximating the idea. That is a way of thinking that was common for 5,000 years of recorded history. It's no longer common. It's not common in our modern universities and colleges. My son is just starting to take college classes, and he already has this a reflection paper, and it's all about his wishes, desires, feelings. It's nothing about discerning or discovering some standard of excellence and then trying to measure up to that. The way we tend to think, we tend to internalize everything. If someone asks an ordinary progressive American today, are you a good person? Are you a good citizen? I think most modern Americans would think, well, what I'm being asked is, how do I feel about myself.
Right. Absolutely.
And if they feel like they're a good citizen, then they must be a good citizen, at least from their perspective. Yeah. And there is no object, right? There's nothing outside of them to compare it to. And that's one of the reasons we have our precepts, we have our virtues, and we say, here are these ideas. And it's not really how you feel about yourself. It is, can you live up to these? Can you achieve these goals, these ways of life? Can you be self-assertive and self-restrained and productive and have civic knowledge, right? Can you actually achieve those goals? And I think this is one of the tragedies of the modern progressive world is we've lost this ability to look outside ourselves and discover objective standards of excellence and then strive for those. We tend simply to internalize everything and talk about how we feel.
Well, that goes back to the nihilistic approach of truth.
Yes.
Right? I mean, so hopefully you're right. When you say that you've learned this year that truth matters, I hope upon hope that you were right. Because
I think Americans right now, my fellow citizens, seem to be insisting that truth matters. I just saw there's a popular, she calls herself a journalist, Rachel Maddow, she's on TV, and she posted some fraudulent story about Oklahoma, and the fraudulent story was a whole bunch of people were being hospitalized because of what's the name of the medicine?
Ivermectin.
Yeah. And it turns out the story was bogus and fraudulent, and she never took down her tweets and everything.
Of course not.
But this has caused something of a storm on social media. People are actually upset that she posted this false, fraudulent story, didn't correct it, didn't take it down, just let it stay as if it's the truth. And a large number of people got upset with that. And I'm thinking, good for you. You actually seem to be caring about the truth.
And I will say to the same point and to their credit, there are a lot of people watching Joe Biden right now walk around saying the way we left Afghanistan was a success. I mean, that's literally the path he's taken. He is sitting there in front of every camera he can saying, we successfully ended the war in Afghanistan. That was a success. He's going to campaign, assuming he runs again in 24.
Right.
He's going to campaign on the success he had in leaving Afghanistan. And everybody's sitting there saying, Joe, that wasn't successful.
Right.
There is no version of that was successful. There's no version of that story. So
God, I have a this is going to bother partisans of all kinds, but I would love to see a conversation between George W. Bush and Joe Biden. George W. Bush was the first to send troops to Afghanistan. I was highly critical when that happened. I was publishing essays all over the place challenging President Bush for not providing a clear definition of victory. Why are we sending troops anywhere?
Sure.
If there's no clearly defined notion of victory? Because if they don't know what victory is, if we don't know what victory is, how in the world can we achieve it? How do you right? The whole idea of thinking strategically is identify the ends, the goal, and then figure out what means will best achieve the goal. But if there's no clearly defined goal, you don't know what mean. And so he gets us into this into this kind of boondoggle, and Joe Biden is the one who pulls the troops out in an incredibly reckless, foolish way. Not just foolish to the level that people die. It was so foolish and reckless.
It's a very dangerous situation.
And so I would love to hear a conversation of those two, the current president and a former president, Bush and Biden, and ask this question: were we victorious in Afghanistan? Right. And if so, what does that mean? How do you define victory? Well, and see what they have to say about that.
I think it would be fairly predictable what you'd see. You'd see George Bush saying, "No, we weren't successful, but it's Obama and Trump and Biden's fault."
Probably.
And Biden saying, "No, we weren't successful, but I did what I had to do because this guy sitting next to me got us into a war we never should have gotten into."
Yeah, I made it the best.
We would have had fingers pointing and neither of them. And the worst part about it is neither of them would have been truthful about what their objectives were in the first place.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, there's a lot we'll never know about George Bush's real intentions of getting involved in Afghanistan and Iraq following 9/11. Did he see it as a political opportunity, or was he really doing it because he thought it was what the right thing to do for the country was?
Yeah, and I'm sure, and again, I'm the first to always point out, no one can crawl inside someone else's mind. I don't know what was going on in George W. Bush's mind, but watching him, and I was watching very, very closely when all of that happened. I was still in graduate school when all that happened, and so I was up to my eyeballs studying politics in both a theoretical way and at a practical level, and then 9/11 happens, and I'm watching all these things, and I'm surrounded by Harry Jaffa and Larry Arnn and Charles Kessler and all these great thinkers, and I infer from Bush's statements and choices that he felt tremendous pressure to do something.
Sure.
Even if nobody really knew what the thing was, just go do something. You got to do something. And I think that was a big component of his choice to go to Iraq and then go to Afghanistan.
Without a doubt. It's also interesting. I think we've seen over the last few weeks, let alone the last year, as we reflect on the last year, but over the last few weeks, we've seen the reality of the military-industrial complex that even Eisenhower talked about, and we can go back on. You were in graduate school when 9/11 happened. I was in college when 9/11 happened. I was in my third class with a specific professor who graduated near the top of his class at West Point, worked in George Bush Sr. in H.W. Bush's Department of Defense. I got a lot of my early thoughts about 9/11 from him.
Right.
And he was part of that military-industrial complex. And it's interesting, and I would love to go back and have a conversation with him, just because where I am now politically and in terms of understanding, and where I was as a couple years into a political science degree, University of Colorado, which let's not even talk about what that really meant. But I would love to go back and have a conversation with him now, because he was a registered libertarian, part of the military-industrial complex.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of conflict just in that our chapters are talking about in their case study this month. Their September case study is really all about that.
Yep.
But there is that conflict there. But I got a lot from him, and he and I became really close during that time. And he's saying, we've got to go do something. We've got to go do something over and over and over again. This guy who probably doesn't like getting involved in a lot of foreign wars.
Right.
I guarantee he was not a fan of how Bush went about it.
Right. By the way, you mentioned that speech from Eisenhower. I'll just refer so that people can find it if they want to. Do a quick Google or YouTube search. It's actually Eisenhower's farewell address. At the very end of his term, he gave that speech 2 or 3 days before John F. Kennedy, who was the newly elected president, was sworn in. And in that, and it's a very short speech. I mean, surprisingly short. You can read it in 2 minutes, 3 minutes. It's not a long speech. And he warns of 2 great transformations that he fears, that he's genuinely worried about. One is it's most known for, what he calls that military industrial complex that we have. He points to the fact that as a young officer himself, he was in the military before there was a Department of Defense.
Right.
There used to be a Department of War, which was, as its name implies, when the United States was at war, the Department of War was a big, important place. A lot was going on. But when the United States was at peace, it was crickets in the Department of War. Very little was actually going on.
To that point, just to jump in real quick, because this was some learning I got from one of our guardians, right? And you and I both try to learn from our guardians as much as we try to provide. The early days of the Department of War, it was just as bureaucratic as it is now. They looked at things and said, well, we need to justify our job. We want to keep this, and they used it as an excuse for war with the Indians.
Good point.
And the Department of War largely consisted of, let's just keep wars going with Indian tribes so that we can stay in control and still have a job.
It's a great point. And then through the course of the two great world wars, all of that becomes enormous. And then what happens as you have this permanent, gigantic war-making apparatus, part of the government, they need supplies. They need all kinds of things. And that's the industrial part. So you have entire industries who have one customer, the federal government. They're contractors for the federal government, and they're sitting in the meetings talking about what the government's going to buy and how much they're going to pay and all those sort of things. So that was one concern that Eisenhower had, was that relationship between a gigantic bureaucratic war-making part of the government and private industry that was supplying it and getting wealthy off of endless continuous war. The other thing that Eisenhower warned against was the transformation of higher education. This is really interesting. He's explicit about this. He says, research used to be an individual endeavor, or maybe a small team of 2, 3, 4 scientists. And it was conducting experiments and reading and studying some history. That was research. Now, he says, research has become this such a big thing and such an expensive thing. Increasingly, it's relying on tax dollars, government funding. And he warns against this, that to the degree that universities come to rely on government funding, the universities will be less interested in genuine scientific and academic research and more partisan, more willing to do what those in government want them to do, provide whatever results those in government want them to provide. And I mean, my goodness, this was Eisenhower in 1961, and he's describing the world that we have today.
Right. It's sort of a sad commentary that it took that long from the beginning of progressivism, from the early ideas coming back to the United States from Europe, specifically from Germany, of progressivism, where they were taking over the colleges and universities then.
Yep.
And it 60, 70, 80 years before anybody on a major stage, on a major soapbox, started talking about it.
Well, and I'm gonna I want to mention also. I mean, since this is for my Jewish friends, this is a time of reflection. It's appropriate as part of that reflection. We're just a few days away from the 20th anniversary of 9/11, which we both mentioned, and like most adults, I remember that probably as clear as any other day. And very shortly after, I started writing newspaper essays. I used to have a friendship with the editor at the Los Angeles Times, who was kind of a lefty progressive type, but we had a mutual respect for each other. And he would publish pieces of mine. And so I wrote a piece in the Los Angeles Times, and I pointed out that the terrorists who committed those acts of mass murder and the regimes and the other organizations that offered aid and comfort to them, all of them, they knew that they could not win a direct head-to-head confrontation with the United States military. They did not want to take on the United States Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, directly.
Sure.
And that led me to this question. So what was their purpose in hijacking those planes, turning them into missiles, into bombs, vaporizing all those people? What is it they wanted? I speculated. I couldn't prove this, but I said I speculated based on their actions that one of their goals was to destroy the United States indirectly, not by wiping it off the face of the earth, not by blowing up the whole country, but by turning it into something else, so that it would become something else, that it would be transformed from a free, self-governing republic to some kind of police state. That was because when you look at enemies in the United States, what is it they hate most about the United States? The liberty.
Right.
I mean, they loathe that. Those terrorists are controlling people. They want to control how others live. They want to control how others think. They're willing to cut the heads off of people who hold different opinions, who think different thoughts. And that's what I argued in the days immediately following 9/11, is that their real goal was to destroy liberty in America, turn it into some kind of police state. And so my advice to fellow citizens in September of 2001 was, don't let that happen. Don't let our country become a huge police state. Now, this is before TSA was created, right? All those kinds of things. I was begging fellow Americans, be more free than ever. Yeah. That is the way that we will refute them, is to live freely the way that we want to live. And I think it's a fair question on the 20th anniversary of 9/11 to ask, were those terrorists successful in that regard? Did they cause America to become less free? Here's another way to put it. Are we less free or more free today than we were on 9/11?
I don't even think it's an objective question. I think we are less free.
Yeah.
It's hard to know if we're more safe, but we certainly gave up significant amounts of freedom seeking safety.
Right.
We gave up a lot of our freedoms to the state
for the promise of
security. The promise of security.
Mm-hmm.
The scarier part about that is, did we set a precedent? Did they give an example of how to continue to do that? And has COVID been the same thing? Right? I mean, I look around, we're 17 months past 15 days to stop the spread, 16 months past 15 days to stop the spread. I think a lot of the things that we're seeing in public are the new normal. We're seeing the plexiglass between people now on a regular basis. I don't think that's maybe ever going away.
Well, and in fact, I'll go a step farther. This isn't some conspiracy theory. I'm just asking fellow citizens, just think this through. Just be prepared. It's always good to be thoughtful. Part of being thoughtful is to use our imagination to try to imagine. There was a tremendous professor of international relations out in Claremont. His name was Harold Rood, R-O-O-D. And Professor Rood, perhaps better than anyone I've ever seen, could prompt others, students mainly, to use their imagination in ways that they weren't used to. I'll give you one just little example. During the Cold War, he would hold up a map, and you would see North America, and there's the big Gulf of Mexico, and then there's Central and South America. And he'd point to a place like Nicaragua, and he would say, now why do the Russians want to be there? Why are Soviet Russians, right, running to Nicaragua? What? There's bananas. Do they not have bananas? Right? What? There's a bunch of disease and death in the jungles. Right? I mean, what is it? And then he'd say, look straight north of there. There's the Gulf of Mexico, and why there's the mouth of the Mississippi River, which cuts the United North America in half.
Right.
Could they have any interest in that at all? And he's right. He's inviting students. Think it through yourself. He wasn't saying he knew exactly why Soviet Russians were in Central America. He's just saying, look at what they're doing and try to figure it out on your own. Why would they be there? Why are they spending all this time and energy and resources? And that's what I want to prompt with our listeners and fellow citizens. Imagine those who really do want to control others, and they want to regulate, they want to use the power of government to command how others live their life. Would it be a useful thing to release a terrible virus every 18 to 24 months?
Right.
Probably would. Is anybody thinking about that right now? I hope not, but we would be foolish not to think about that, and then think about how do we prevent that actually from happening. One thing we could do, by the way, is stop sending U.S. tax dollars to foreign laboratories that weaponize viruses. That might be a good place to start.
Just a thought. A thought.
So I think you're right. I mean, 20 years later, we are less free than we were on 9/11. We could show all kinds of metrics, from freedom to travel, freedom to communicate, freedom. It's harder to start a business. It's harder to educate your children the way you want to educate them. All kinds of things are more difficult to do than they used to be. I often think from the point of view of progressives, this has all been a great success.
Sure.
I mean, things in general are going their way. They want to keep ratcheting up control and regulation, and that has been the story of the last 2 decades. It's really been the last story of the last 8 decades, 10 decades. But what about non-progressives? For non-progressives, what they see is this growing problem, growing loss of their freedom, growing threats of violence against them, and they're being denounced constantly and ridiculed and mocked if they don't agree with what progressives want to do to them and with them. And this, in a way, you can say the people who are part of the freedom movement, the conservative movement, skeptics of progressivism, from their point of view, things look really dark. Mm-hmm. Things look bad. And they want things to change in the United States. And there's very little agreement how that change should happen. There are many conservatives, many who are within our target audience, make the argument that what really needs to change is America needs to become more religious,
right,
than it is. That is the locus of the problem. America has lost religious faith. American citizens aren't nearly as serious about their religious worship, their religiosity, their relationship with God, and this is the source of the problem.
I'm really glad you brought that up, because it was, as we talk about reflections over the last year and taking a little privilege of it is Rosh Hashanah, that's been a major thought for me as I reflect over the last year. I have been going to political events for years, more decades. And I've always just accepted it as, okay, when I go to an event, I'm the one of maybe just a couple of Jewish Republicans in the room.
Right.
And that is what it is. And I have to accept that that there's going to be their invocations and everything else. And I've just kind of got to stand there and be accepting of it. But over the last year, I've kind of looked at that, and the more and more I think about it, it's almost as if I'm being told I can't be a good American citizen. Mm-hmm. I can't help this country. I can't be a part of this country because they're telling me we need more Jesus in our life. Mm-hmm. And there's a common response to that when I do bring it up with anybody.
Yeah.
I've had many people say to me, the only way we're going to save this country is through a Jesus revival,
right,
a Christian revival in this country. And I say that question. So does that mean I can't be an asset to this country? Yeah.
You're not going to be part of that revival.
Right. I'm not going to be part of that, so I can't be a part of this.
Right.
And they say, no, well, we mean Judeo-Christian. And it's a shift.
Yeah.
And that's a stretch, right?
Yes.
I mean, there's a big difference between a Christian revival
right,
based around the ideas of the New Testament,
right,
and Jesus Christ,
right, versus
a Judeo-Christian based on the Old Testament. Those are two very different things.
Yes, they are.
And that's something over the last year that has been a major thought for me is what is my place within this push for freedom that we have to have today. We absolutely must.
I've been thinking about this subject, studying it, teaching it, writing about it for 25 years. I'm going to start with just a historical fact that is, I believe, beyond dispute. And that is the Americans who engaged in revolution against the British Empire in 1775, 76, and went on to found a new country. Mm-hmm. They were, just speaking in terms of sheer demographics, they were overwhelmingly Christians.
Sure.
That is true. The vast majority of them, if you asked, do you have a religious belief or a religious preference, north of 90%, more than 90% would have said, I'm a Christian. That is true.
Sure.
And what is often lost in these conversations are some other really important historical facts. Virtually every one of the British soldiers who were hunting revolutionaries, hunting them, shooting them, killing them, were also Christians.
Right.
The supreme commander of those British troops was the King of England. He was not merely a Christian, he was the head of the Christian Church of England.
Right.
He was the authority in the Church of England.
And the people who were shooting at those Christian Americans, those Christian British soldiers,
Right.
who were shooting at Christian revolutionary soldiers,
That's right.
believed that he was put there by God.
That's right. That's right.
Right? He wasn't merely just the head of the church. He wasn't elected like Joe Biden or Donald Trump.
That's right.
He was put there by God.
That's right. There's a theory that stretches back to medieval days of the divine right theory of kings. That the king is anointed, appointed ultimately by God. Here's another, just a fact, a historic fact beyond dispute. Within the Western world, within, say, European and surrounding areas, within that world, over the course of the past 2,000 years, it has been overwhelmingly Christian.
Sure.
And the idea that Christianity is compatible with, in fact, the idea that Christianity requires something like a free, self-governing constitutional republic, that comes along very late in the day in the history of Christianity. In fact, someone like James, I'm going to read a little passage here from James Madison. I'll get it out. He points out over the course of the first 1,500 years of Christianity, it's been despotism and theocracy and religious persecution. That's what generations after generations of Christians thought their own religion required. This is from James Madison in 1785, and he's talking about the history of established churches, meaning a church where the government says, this is the official church and you must, by law, you must participate in this church. You must send money and tithe to this church. You'll be punished and you'll be excluded from the protection of the law if you don't. And the church then in turn blessed and ordained the government, usually the king, right? The church said, yes, we just heard from God that, say, George III, right, is actually supposed to be the king. And this is James Madison reflecting on that. He says, experience witnesses that ecclesiastical establishments, that is, established churches, instead of maintaining the purity and efficacy of religion, they've had a contrary operation. During almost 15 centuries, the legal establishment of Christianity has been on trial. What have been its fruits? More or less in all places, pride and indolence in the clergy, ignorance and servility in the laity, and in both, superstition, bigotry, and persecution. That's been the result of 15 centuries of legally established Christianity. And, this points to something really, here's another big historic fact. For the past 2,000 years, in the Western world has been overwhelmingly Christian, which means all the great conflicts have been intra-Christian conflicts for the most part.
Right.
So, we mentioned the American Revolution. It was two Christian armies. They were both praying to those soldiers in both camps. The night before a great battle, they were both praying to the same, right, reading the same Christian New Testament.
Right.
In the cataclysm of the Civil War, it's Christians fighting Christians. Even the whole fight over slavery. You have Christian abolitionists arguing that slavery is incompatible with Christianity, and you have defenders of slavery arguing that slavery is required by Christianity. And both are citing the same Bibles. In the revolution of thought that comes in the progressive era, America is, at that point, somewhere around 95, 96% Christian. The whole population is Christians. The people who elected Woodrow Wilson were Christians. The people who elected FDR, not once, not twice, not thrice, right, but 4 times in a row, those were deeply Christian. That was a deeply Christian nation that did that. And so when we look at these conflicts, what we're really looking at are intra-conflicts within Christianity or among and between Christians. And we seem to forget the beautiful thing that the founders offered us. The founders came along and said, wait, this regime, the government, is going to have one humble goal. It's an important goal, but it's humble. The purpose of government here in the United States is not to save anyone's soul. It's not to make sure everyone goes to heaven or has a right relationship with God. The purpose is simply to protect the individual rights of each citizen. Sure. That's its goal. And if we fall short of that, we should work on it and improve it. There again is looking at a model of excellence outside yourself. That's the goal. That's the standard that we're aiming for. And to be a good American citizen, all you have to do is recognize that your fellow citizens have the same individual natural rights you do. And just like you don't want anyone, including the government, violating your rights, so too you shouldn't be violating the rights of fellow citizens. That's the basic condition to be a good American. And it has nothing to do with religious belief, to the point that in their Constitution, the American founders, in Article 6, this is the original Constitution. This is before the Bill of Rights was added. In Article 6, it prohibits any religious test for office. So if you want to run for office and your fellow citizens elect you to be a member of Congress or something like that, the Constitution says your state, for example, cannot require that you take some religious test or sectarian religious oath. You and I have mentioned many times before, and it's worth throwing out, none other than George Washington himself recognized a group of Jews in Newport, Rhode Island, who had written a beautiful letter to him. He responds, and in his letter, he addresses them as equal and full fellow citizens. This is a group of Jews. He didn't say you can only be a good American, right, if you accept Jesus as your Savior. He didn't say that. He said, we Americans, we don't talk about religious toleration as if it's just one group, indulging in No. You're Americans.
Yes.
And you have the same individual natural rights, the same liberty, the same property, the same right to religious liberty as every other American. And that is such a foundational concept that the Americans solved the problem of European Christian religious persecution. Because in the United States, under the Constitution, operating within this idea of individual natural rights, for the first time really in Western history, you could have a Catholic, a Protestant, a Jew, a non-believer, could all be fellow citizens. They could all be neighbors. They could live on the same block. And the religious beliefs of each in no way was a threat to the rights of the other. The law offered equal protection of the individual rights of each one. And I worry sometimes. I worry that those who want to run in this direction of liberty, that they don't fully appreciate those foundational moral and political truths in the American founding, to the degree that many conservatives today will say, we need to bring more church, more religion into our politics. And I've asked the question, I think you've asked the same question, why aren't more churches inviting in the messages of the American founding?
Right.
The ideas of the American founding.
And those don't have to be political. Those don't have to be political conversations. The American founding was inherently good. It was designed in a way to be good, to allow people to seek good. There's so much to unpack out of everything you just said that we're not going to get through everything. But there's a few things I do want to point out, and I'll do them as quickly as I can. One, you talked about the last 2,000 years and the vast majority of conflicts being amongst Christians
within the Western world.
Within the Western world,
yes.
right? In the Eastern world, especially the Middle East,
yes.
There was a lot of fighting amongst Muslims and
yes.
Islam, some amongst Jews, but
yes.
within there, but very little. In the Western world, you're right. The role of Jews throughout that entire process was mostly that of slaves, right?
Right.
So I look back and I look at all of those. This wasn't a war between Christians and Jews or Christians and Arabs. It was, you look at a time of somebody like Charlemagne. Charlemagne was a Christian. He joined the Holy Roman Church.
That's right.
But there was still a conflict. There was an inherent conflict between him and the Holy Roman Church because he didn't want to give them their money, his money, right?
Right.
He said, I won this in wars fair and square before I was a part of your church, and I don't want to give it up. And all of a sudden, he enslaves hundreds of Jews and says, okay, you're going to watch my money because you don't have to answer to that church. But if you do anything I don't like with it, I'm going to kill you.
Right.
So you have these battles, and the Jews were very much just pawns within that. Moving forward, one of the realizations, again, that I had over the last year is really how insignificant a voting bloc we are as Jewish people, right? The Jews in America make up about 5.5 to 6.5 million people.
Okay.
That's it. That's a lot of people. I mean, I've had friends who have said there's about 1 billion Jews on the planet. No, there's 13.5 million of us. That's it.
On the planet.
In the planet.
So in the United States, we're talking, that's something like between 1% and 2% of the population.
If that.
Somewhere.
I think it's more like
less than 1%?
A third to a fourth of a percent.
Okay. I was trying to do some quick math there.
0.3 to 0.4%, right?
Okay.
Like we're talking just a tiny little
Right.
third of the population,
Right.
third of a percent of the population. And at the same time, what's so beautiful about this country, what's so beautiful about the founding of this country is it was founded in a way that I am just as able to go seek salvation through God in my own way, through my synagogue, through my rabbi, freely. And if you start bringing in those Christian ideas into government, if you start saying we need to be a Christian nation, does that freedom disappear? And I ask that meaningfully because it has in every circumstance throughout history.
You know, I want to weave in here. One of the many listeners know that I'm a student of Harry Jaffa. He was really my mentor and main professor in graduate school. And one of Professor Jaffa's truly great original insights was that in the course of Western civilization, there were sort of two camps, two main claims to what the highest form of life was. One is the religious claim that the highest purpose of human life is devotion to God. And then, of course, there's all kinds of disputes about what does that mean. The other is the ancient Greek claim that the life of the quest for truth is the highest calling in life, the highest purpose of life. And what Professor Jaffa saw clearly is that the American regime, the American founding, by lowering the goals of government and saying government's just going to protect liberty, that's it, it in no way lowered the goals of human life. If anything, it leaves us freer to pursue them. And for every thinking human being to make a choice, right, should I be following the philosophic quest for truth? Should I devote myself to the living God? Is it something else, right? How do I think about these things? Within a free United States of America, each individual is free to pursue these things as they see fit. Yes. In all prior regimes, the government, the law, came down forcefully and said, we're going to tell you what the highest purpose is that you're going to follow. And if you don't, we're going to punish you or torture you or do some terrible thing. And that too is part of the beauty of the American founding by lowering by saying we're not going to use government to save souls. We're not going to use government to convert people to a certain religious belief. We're not going to make the government an engine of philosophic or scientific inquiry and say that's what you have to. We're just going to protect liberty.
Right.
And then you go figure out what you think is the highest calling in life and what you should devote yourself to.
Right. So I want to leave our members, our listeners, with a thought and a potentially a challenge. And some might think, Dave, you're wrong. You don't get it. You don't understand. But I hope some people will take this. There are two ways to go about it. There are the people who want to start injecting more Christianity and scripture into America, into our government. Mm-hmm. I've been taking this challenge in a different direction. I have been trying to take the ideas of our founding, the freedom inherent to our founding, and find the overlaps in Judaism, and go to my synagogue community, go to my rabbi, go to my family, and talk about those things and try to insert the American founding where it overlaps. And I'm not saying add things to your religion.
Right.
I'm saying find those areas of overlap. And I'm going to give a really quick example. There's a very important prayer in every Jewish service, in every synagogue, called the Amidah. And in the Amidah, there is a line, and within that line are 3 words. They talk about the tyranny of arrogance. And I sat back and I think about things like Federalist 51, and I think about the writings of our founders, and I think about all of these things. And I say, this prayer that's been a foundation, it's been a rock of Judaism for probably thousands of years, is reflected by our founders. And they looked at government the same way. And I saw that as an opportunity. So instead of going and saying, well, I want you guys to better understand Judaism, so you can understand this line. No, I think our founders got it. I want my synagogue community to understand
the founders.
How great the founders' thinking was. Because if you're a Jew, or if you're a Christian who believes in the Old Testament and the Judeo-Christian idea, you're going to say the same thing. Look, what the founders did here was really good. We as a synagogue community need to recognize that. And it's a way of getting more people to accept the American idea, which we are guardians of, rather than trying to change the American idea by bringing religion further into it.
What an amazing, I mean, I'm no preacher, I'm no rabbi, Dave, but I can imagine an incredible sermon, right? Where talking about the American founders and said they realized it's arrogant to think that the federal government should be commanding and dictating how people live their lives. And so what did those founders do? They limited the powers of the federal government and actually wrote them down in a constitution and said, this is it. This is all you get to do in the federal government. People are going to live freely other than that and make their own choices. Don't be so arrogant as to think you get to command all the details of people's lives. There's a sermon that wouldn't most religion, whether they're churches or synagogues, wouldn't that fit in beautifully?
Absolutely.
With the core teachings.
And there's nothing Republican or Democrat about it. There's nothing even political about it. Just talk to people about what the tyranny of arrogance really means. When this book says it is one of the greatest evils in the world, the tyranny of arrogance, we will never be at peace while there is a tyranny of arrogance. It is evil. Have that conversation. It's beautiful, and it mirrors what the founders tried to do.
We have millions of fellow citizens right now who are so arrogant. They think they should be using the power of government to command how other people run their businesses, how they raise their children. I mean, all kinds of things. They think they have that rightful authority and power. And what they really have is arrogance.
So what does it mean to be a guardian of the American idea? It doesn't mean to start changing it. It doesn't mean to start arguing that we need to change it. It means to go show other people who believe in something else over here how those two things overlap. And why the American idea is so good and right. And I hope more people do that.
I want to restate and expand your challenge. I think it would be great Americans who are really involved in their churches and who have close relationships with their pastors, their preachers, their priests. Invite them to look at some of the core documents of the American founding, the Declaration of Independence, passages from the United States Constitution, Jefferson's beautiful, and I use that word very purposely, beautiful Virginia statute on religious liberty that begins famously, Almighty God hath created the mind free, and concludes from that, that everyone therefore has a right to religious liberty. Take some of the American founding and start putting that in our churches. Include some of that in our sermons. Not as as you said, not as a replacement. We're not saying this is the Word of God. We're saying here is a wonderful practical application of some of these fundamental principles that Christians and Jews should appreciate and practice themselves.
Absolutely. And that's how we will continue to be the guardians of the American idea. Nos somos custodes.
Till next time.